We are 1 week away from the War Within being released and a month away from the actual Mythic Plus being released for the Season 1, but what is going to be meta? Well, we're gonna predict the range DPS specs today with plenty of disclaimers that you're probably going to skip on. So with that out of the way, let's just get right into it. Okay. We're gonna start off with Affliction, and I'll probably repeat myself throughout the duration of this video with some of these things. You're probably going to be seeing some damage breakdowns and some overalls from the dungeons that we've been able to find logs on, some of them higher, some of them lower, and some of this damage will be different because our eye level on beta scales with the level of the key. So if we manage to find a log that's like a +4 key, overall the numbers are going to be way lower than on a +15. With that being said, the way that Affliction looks right now, it's actually doing a lot of damage. So I'm going to put it into A tier and kind of justify why. It's actually competing with the S tier specs in terms of overall damage, although I have a hard time figuring out why you would want an Affliction in a top of the meta, because S tier is going to be, most likely what we predict that the top players will push keys with, and A tier will be like the competitors, right? Like something that you can swap out. You're probably still going to reach the higher end keys, but you might lack something, which is why we're at Affliction right now, because you don't really bring much. You have a battle res, sure, but there are definitely other specs way better suited to bring that battle res than you, considering that Warlock battle res is one of the worst ones in the game that you have to hard cast for such a long time, and Gate could be good for skipping. Like I can see Gate being really good on Mists of Turnaside to skip the third pack, depending on how you pull them, to just bypass that through the wall. You can still do that, and Hellstones are never a bad thing to have for overall sustain and healing yourself from the damage intake. But outside of that, it just feels like it's a big damage spec, which is great. I mean, if you want to do damage, Affliction is definitely a spec that can fulfill that for you, and predicting where it is, it's going to land it on A. Now I don't know if that's going to be true or not, but we will see. And you don't need to predict your range DPS always, since with today's sponsor War Thunder, you will know exactly where and how hard you will hit your opponent. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, available for free on both PC and consoles, where you can pilot over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships, all belonging to 10 major nations. The type of war machines you will command can range from biplanes and armored cars dating to the 1920s all the way to the modern fighter jets and main battle tanks. Since we are all fans of immersion here, War Thunder brings that in spades with how intense the combat is, giving you incredible detailed machines, super authentic graphics coupled with sound effects, which work really well to put you in the zone as the pilot of all of these vehicles of war. War Thunder has a massive worldwide community of over 70 million players, which you can engage with in glorious PvP battle. And if you are a history and military buff, you will enjoy the uniqueness of War Thunder's authenticity when it comes to its wealth of high-quality content. And I mentioned earlier that this game will make sure you know exactly what, who, and where you will hit. Not only does it have one of the most sophisticated damage models for vehicles in the gaming industry, with detailed individual components like engines, fuel tanks, weapons, and even crew, but all of these aspects can take damage from your weapons, which causes the systems to even be disabled. To make sure this system is even more accurate, War Thunder shows you how vehicles get destroyed by showcasing an X-ray view of exactly what happened from when the shell penetrated the armor to what damage it caused. War Thunder is a free-to-play game on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox, and you can start rocking it right now by clicking the pinned link down below to also support your boys here. Also, if you are a new or returning player that hasn't played in the last 6 months, by using our link, you will get access to a massive bonus pack available across all platforms, which includes the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 Silver Lions, 7 days of premium account, and multiple other premium vehicles, all for a limited time only. Moving to Augmentation, probably to nobody's surprise, I will put it around in S tier. We have looked at dozens and hundreds of logs and obviously played a bunch of beta for the last couple of months as well. It's looking like Augmentation is probably at this point mandatory for high-end pushes. I haven't really seen a key above 12-13 done in time, that did not have an augmentation unless it was like this weird wild key that's just outside of the meta. And that's really why augmentation is so high up. The damage is actually way better than it is right now in Dragonflight compared to all the other specs. I mean, you can probably see right now some breakdown of the overalls of some of the augmentations, and that's not necessarily new. It has been having a high amount of damage throughout the cycle of the beta. Likely, maybe it's going to be nerfed. I mean, we know that the nerfs have happened to Ebon Might, and Close as Clutch Mates being removed and a bunch of other stuff. Most likely other nerfs coming in soon, since I think I can speak for the majority of the players that were probably tired of seeing augmentation mandatory. Listen, it's not a bad spec. I don't mind if people are actually playing with it, but it feels like it's mandatory with the tank changes, with how squishy some people are, with how hard it was for some of the top players to actually clear plus 12s and 13 on the beta. It is crazy, and augmentation just makes that so much easier. And the fact that it actually has damage now is kind of like an almost guaranteed S tier, unless we just see it nerfed into the ground. Until then, we're gonna talk about another spec that's nerfed into the ground, which is balance. Well, it's not really nerfed into the ground, but I will put it at F tier. Its damage is actually not that bad. It has actually competitive damage with a lot of other specs as well. It was kind of hard to find anybody play Balanced Druid, so we've had other people play it in Archies. We've played it ourselves a little bit, but the playstyle is just atrocious. Not to mention that Balanced Druid has been a very sketchy spec to pick in Mythic Plus when it comes to meta because of its unique way of dealing damage, which is, you know, spread AoE with a lot of dots. The damage profile of Balanced Druid requires a lot of ramp up to make sure that everything has dots on them and a lot of build up. Once you pop your cooldowns, it will take about 5 to 10 seconds to maybe start actually blowing on the meters, and that's just a very, very long time considering specs that have historically huge ramp ups like Affliction and Unholy can just do that in like 6 seconds now, as opposed to like 20 that Balance does. And even if you end up doing that amount of damage, you have to hard cast Starfires. Sure, Balanced Druid offers a lot of good Druid things like Mark of the Wild, Battle Res, the Druid utility of just shifting out of roots, dispelling curses, which is going to be pretty big in the War Within. Listen, if you have a curse display, you're going to be golden considering some of the dungeon debuffs, but there are so many way better specs that can bring that as opposed to Balance. Not to mention, F is not just because of its throughput, because the throughput once again is not necessarily bad, but it's just the overall appeal. There is close to zero appeal to play this spec. I don't know what's going on with Balance in terms of its design, but main Balanced Druids are just swapping off, and we know a couple. I don't know how far they're gonna stay with not playing Balanced Druid, but this is not it, Chief. So unfortunately, that's where it goes. Arcane is a difficult one to rank because I want to put it into S tier. Currently, in terms of our research and playtesting, Arcane has been the spec that did almost the most amount of damage. And I say almost because we're gonna get to Frost in a second. But Arcane is also the only real mage spec that we have seen people push high in terms of logs, because we have to look at logs to kind of figure out exactly what the numbers are. Sure, we can snipe some streams here and there and see people play Arcane like Gingy, which he's playing Arcane, but he's playing a different mage spec. We'll get to that in a second. But outside of that, it's really anybody's game because the tuning on mage has been up and down in the past month or so, where other mage specs are not as fortunate as Arcane to make it all the way up here. So it could be S tier, but it could drop down to A tier, depending on the composition of what we expect the actual, you know, pushing team to be. Arcane is looking like a solid contender because it's a mage spec. You definitely want a mage spec for obvious reasons, but you might not want Arcane for that mage spec, so we'll see how that evolves. Beast Mastery is nowhere. I couldn't find the beast. I think it's similar to Balanced Druid, where I'm gonna put it into C tier. It's probably a little bit better than Balance, but it's also a very unappealing spec to play. The hero talents are actually, in our opinion, the worst combination of hero talents possible. There's the two worst hero talent trees in the game in terms of how boring they are and how much tuning they need. Every week, with the exception of this week, as you're watching this video, has been a week where Black Arrow has been buffed by 100%. And it's still useless. It doesn't feel like the hero talents will elevate Beast Mastery to provide meaningful impact to the teams, something that, let's say, other Hunter specs won't be able to do anyway. And the damage is whatever. I feel like in terms of damage, if we're going to be predicting the damage of Beast Mastery, irrespective of what it's doing right now on the beta in terms of logs and everything like that, it's probably going to be really good. Beast Mastery damage is always above average. It's sometimes top of the meta, sometimes very rarely below average, but it's usually good because it is the second most played spec in the game currently. So you know Blizzard doesn't really want to upset one of their biggest chunks of players in their community. So with that in mind, it's probably fine, but I don't see it rise any higher than C tier. Demonology has been one of the Warlock specs as well that we've had very few information on, because there are definitely logs with Demonology that we can analyze, but they're so old and Warlocks have received so many changes across the last couple of months that it's very hard to judge where it is from that logs. I feel like Demonology is probably going to be at least B tier. It could be A tier. I don't think it's as close to Affliction in terms of the overall performance, and seeing as how most Warlock players prefer to play Affliction over any other Warlock specs, I can imagine that that's probably where the meta is going to land in terms of Warlock spec performance. So Demonology is going to take a dip. However, Demonology does have a lot of damage, and I have seen people destroy with Demonology in some of the hierarchies. So I don't expect it to be entirely bad, but since Warlock is not usually a desired class in Mythic Plus unless it's broken, and yeah, if you don't believe me, I mean, I don't know, look at past seasons when I guess Destruction has been pretty meta, and even Demo has been pretty meta. They were usually meta when they were just broken in terms of damage. Never because of, oh my god, I want this Warlock utility so bad. Probably not. Similar situation with Destruction. Now, I don't know which one is better. I guess maybe we can put Destruction in front of Demonology. Although Destruction is under the spotlight to receive some weird nerfs because it's using Rain of Fire in single target, and it has been for the last couple of weeks. Maybe not as much anymore with the recent nerfs, and we're still waiting to see more changes to it. Overall, in terms of damage, it's not bad. Like, all Warlock specs are decent. I'm not sure if it holds a candle to Affliction once again. So for the same arguments that we've ranked Demonology into B tier, I expect Destro to be around B tier. And once again, as kind of like a disclaimer, this is a prediction video. I'm like predicting where it would land up, not necessarily analyzing where it is now, because if we're gonna rank specs based off the current performance of people on beta, a lot of specs won't even make it into the actual tier list because nobody fucking plays shit like Balance Dreams, for instance, or the next one. God damn. Okay, so here's a good point in time in this video where ideally maybe you shouldn't have skipped to, but well, we're gonna troll the people actually skipping to the mage section, because right now I really want to rank Fire Mage around F tier. So this is a good example as to why this is a prediction and not an analysis of the current beta meta. Fire Mage right now is horrible. It actually is the worst mage spec. It's probably one of the worst DPSers in the game, at least in the range department. For the life of me, with the recent nerfs, I can barely out DPS a Prot Warrior. It's been depressing. I've recently played it myself. It is in no good shape to actually go into the war within. I expect Fire Mage to actually get buffs. I really do, because the Living Bomb nerfs just completely killed that mechanic for the spec. And even if you invest, what, 8 talent points? How many do we have for Living Bomb? It barely does anything right now, and it's unclear where the damage profile for Fire Mage is. As a dumbass Fire Mage myself, because I couldn't really find good Fire Mages in the logs anymore unless they're like hiding their performance, which I doubt, I managed to see that Flame Strike could do a lot of damage, especially if you talent into Quick Flame. So that would be good for like lower keys, and it can scale pretty highly. But even with all of that, the burst is a shadow of its former self, and I actually expect it to be buffed. I actually expect it to be buffed so much that it will not end up in F tier, I don't think. It will be a little bit higher. I will put it at least into B tier, and this is because I predict it will get buffs, not because it is this good right now. So we'll see how the meta essentially lands. It has potential, of course, to be an S tier spec, as always. Although historically Fire Mage has been particularly poor at the beginning of an expansion, it's probably the mage, well, it's not just all mage specs do this, but it's one of those specs that scales really well with a lot of gear and a lot of haste and all of that good stuff, which is obviously not what we're going to have at the beginning of an expansion, and it wouldn't be anything new. It was the same for Dragonflight. I think first season Fire Mage was one of the worst DPS specs in the game, definitely in the raid, but well, around there in Mythic Plus as well, until it got a little bit of rework, but you know, got a lot more gear as well. Frost Mage is what the contender for Arcane is, and I want to put it in front, and I have a very, very weird reason why. which is not a particularly good reason, but it is a prediction, so let's have fun with it. There's no logs with Frost Mage clearing very high keys. And I think we all know, if you've been paying attention to beta, Frost Mage really has a lot of damage, and it's up there with Arcane in terms of how good the performance is, and it is a mage spec that you'll definitely want, whether it is Frost or Arcane. Right now it's still unclear, but the fact that people like Gingy play Frost almost entirely in their streams and keep pushing keys with Frost Mage, but weirdly enough, there's no logs with Frost Mage clearing high keys, probably assumes that the most MDA players are kind of hiding their performance to, you know, not really give it away for, I don't know, maybe content creators like us, or maybe I'm coping, but it's fine. It is a prediction anyway. Frost Mage is legit really good. It's less restrictive than Arcane is, since you can just chill and do your damage, haha, across the board, and you have no conditions with the tank to pull one way or another, although, you know, that would be great if you can, you know, just have big pulls in your icy veins. But Frost Mage is generally going to be very solid, if not the best mage spec out there. However, right now, Arcane is kind of giving it a run for its money. Marksmanship is a very biased spec that I'm going to be ranking fairly high, higher than maybe most people like to agree, because I do feel like it has great potential and maybe one of the best hunter specs to perform in Mythic Plus at the moment, considering that it doesn't look like Survival is going to be getting any new buffs, because yeah, if we would have had melee DPS spec here, I think Survival would have been probably somewhere around B tier in my estimate. Although obviously this can change at any point in time with the tuning phase, with some of the higher players figuring out a unique way of playing Survival that would out DPS Marksmanship, because Hunter specs are never really bad for Mythic Plus. They're better than Warlock specs. They do bring Bloodlust, although I don't know about Marksmanship, but Marksmanship just has that explosive AoE burst that's so available and so on hand that it's very hard to really find a spec that can compete with it in terms of burst. I don't know how Marksmanship will scale the higher the keys go, and honestly, I would actually really want to see an MDI meta, or you know, an M plus meta, where Marksmanship is in the top keys cleared, because it is a very fun hunter spec to play, very simple and just explodes everything all around. But I don't think it's gonna be S tier material. At the very most, it's A tier, and I'm kind of putting it A tier with a little bit of charitability, since it's been a long time since we've seen Marksmanship actually perform really well. Devastation, it's Devastation, but I say Devastation because I was gonna say it ranked something like D tier or whatever, it doesn't matter. Devastation actually has really high amounts of damage, and similar to Frost Mage, it's been suspiciously absent from the Warcraft logs meta, but when you manage to find a weird log hidden in the corners of the internet, you find Devastation destroying the logs. Now, there's a reason why it's probably not S tier. I would have probably wanted to put it into S tier, but it's not going to compete with Devastation, and it's looking like Preservation is a pretty good healer as well, since some people have been doing the only 15s logged so far with Preservation, so I expect that it's going to be a decent spec in the end. And you don't really want two Evokers, and Devastation is still, I mean, Evokers, with the exception of Augmentation, are still a squishy class. So it's hard for me to see it in S tier, even though the damage is very competitive with S tier specs. And obviously the utility of Evokers is just really good, but Augmentation just knocks it out of the park. I suspect we're probably going to see some Vengeance Demon Hunter level nerfs to Augmentation soon, where they just brick its utility, the same way that Vengeance lost its double sigil thing. And that will probably bump Augmentation a little bit lower, and we might see Devastation. Jesus, I'm constantly confusing these two. We might see Devastation overtake Augmentation as the desired Evoker spec. That would be interesting to see, but unlikely at this point. Elemental is also another big, fat pomper. It's been buffed, it's been nerfed, it's been buffed again, and right now it's a competitor for A tier. Once again, the A tier is where we predict to be the specs with the most damage, similar to S tier, but S tier is just where they have also some added utility that benefits the overall team. Now, there's a potential for Elemental to be a more desired spec than Affliction, for instance, because as a Shaman, you bring a lot of totem utility that's going to be very good later on, like Poison Cleansing Totem, and there are some nasty poisons out there. You also have Bloodlust, But I don't know if you're ever going to be in a party that doesn't already have a mage or an evoker or both. So that Bloodlust edition is like kind of neither here nor there. There's some unique things that elemental and general shamans will be able to do, like Tremor Totem, the first boss in Mists of Tyrna Scythe, which is going to be really good considering that the tyrannical version of this boss will probably see you be hit by fear almost every week, where, I mean, I guess Tyrannical is available all the time, so it's gonna be every week now, unless you just like blast the key. But I don't think in terms of like constantly scaling the key level with your constant scaled player power is ever going to land a party in a point where they can beat the timer for the fear. Unlikely, although you could get Restoration Shaman to bring that Tremor Totem, so that kind of cuts away some of the utility that Elemental could bring. Either way, the value of an elemental is probably higher than we may have seen in past seasons, and the fact that it also does killer damage, unless it's gonna get nerfed again, is also a big selling point for why it's all the way here. I still have a hard time seeing it into S tier, but we'll see how things progress. And closing it off with Shadow Priest, I expect Shadow Priest to be A tier. Now, with a disclaimer as well, because Shadow Priest doesn't have some of the biggest damage so far. It's kind of being buffed as we speak, and it's still not. It's probably the lowest performer in A tier, maybe kind of closer to marksmanship than any other spec. But I do expect and predict that Priest is going to be a good class in the meta for Mythic Plus. Now, I don't know if that's going to come in the form of a Holy Priest, probably not a Discipline Priest at this point, or a Shadow Priest, because Mass Dispel is so good. It also depends on how the affixes evolve, because we still have the Devour affix that requires dispels, and the Mass Dispel for Shadow Priest can be so good in situations where the healer is already super busy with dispelling other mechanics that happen in Mythic Plus at the same time with this Devour affix. I feel like that in and of itself is going to be really, really valuable. Obviously, Power Infusion is always valuable. And considering that some of the top specs that were probably going to make it into meta are specs that really like Power Infusion, also in the melee category, which we're going to have it ready for you guys next week. But as it stands, this is where Shadow Priest will land in terms of the overall meta. It's going to be in A tier. Thank you again, War Thunder, for sponsoring this video. Remember that the new and returning players bonus is limited time only, and you can get it by clicking our link below to start playing War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox, to get that sweet Eagle of Valor Decorator, 100,000 Silver Lions, 7 days of premium to start you off just right, and a whole bunch of premium vehicles. Have fun on the battlefield.